Hi, I'm Keith Marsley Erickson, and I'm going to be talking with you about my paper, What Do Shareholders Want? Consumer Welfare and the Objective of the Firm. There's a normative question about what firms should maximize. On the one hand, there's the view of Milton Friedman and others that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. On the other side of a spectrum is the stakeholder theory of the firm, where this firm should consider its impacts on all the various stakeholders, not just shareholders. There's also a positive question. Economic theory typically assumes that shareholders want the firm to maximize financial value. Today we're going to ask, empirically, what do the shareholders who own the firm want? I'm going to be talking a bit about shareholder welfare versus financial value. This comes from Hart and Zingalis, who talked about that shareholders have various motivations and argue that firms should maximize shareholder welfare, which is distinct from the financial returns that the firm gets. This idea is linked to the ESG investing movement and corporate social responsibility concerns. If you think about what shareholders want, their total utility, it includes not just the money and profits from this firm, but also environmental, social governance returns, as well as profits of other firms that they own, the common ownership debate. Well, we really hone in on what shareholders' objectives are. The ESG and CSR movements have typically focused on production processes and governance and ethics, such as the environmental consequence of how we produce a product or how employees are treated. I'm going to ask a quite different question today, which is how should firms set prices in imperfectly competitive markets? Pricing is largely ignored despite consumer surplus, the benefits to consumers, being a social objective. Lower prices are a unique technology that firms have that enable them to promote the welfare of consumers, and economists know a lot about the structure of this technology. So a common question at this point is, why not just let shareholders donate, maximize profits, and shareholders do what they want with them? So it's often claimed that because shareholders individually can donate to charity, the firms should not. And firms may not, in fact, have a comparative advantage for charitable donations. However, there's a line of literature that suggests that a donation from the firm commits others to give, other shareholders to give to a public good. Public goods we know are underprovided, and a collective action mechanism could be one. So that's one reason why a firm might even choose to donate to charity. But there's another even more important reason. The firm has a comparative advantage in acting in certain areas where it's not as effective to take that money, go to charity, and give it to that charity instead. So one example is where a public good like pollution, a clean environment, is inseparable from the production process, and it's much easier to prevent the pollution than to clean it up afterward. Also, when we have these negative externalities, producing less is often a cheaper option than fixing it once you've made that pollution. So a firm might have a comparative advantage to act. I'm going to talk today about a theory about how shareholders that have both self-regarding, selfish reasons, and altruistic motivations will want firms to set prices in markets with imperfect competition. I'll derive a modified markup pricing rule, and it depends on the weight on consumer surplus that shareholders would like to place on it. I'll take a discussion of rough parameters from the literature, what we know, what should we expect that weight on consumer surplus to be from shareholders. That weight will be non-trivial before we even get into new evidence, which is a survey experiment. And I'll ask how stockholders and non-stockholders trade off profits versus benefits to consumers. I'll have recruited an approximately representative sample of the United States from the Rand American Life panel, and I'll find that the weight on consumer surplus is non-trivial. The median weight is 0.44. So what would that mean is that the median individual is indifferent between $100 in benefits to consumers versus $44 in profits. So they require more for consumers than they give up in profits for it to be worthwhile to give up something in profits. And we actually have a number. I'll talk more about that. So let's start with a model of individuals. There's a large number of individuals. Each individual is individual I, and they're going to own fraction alpha of the firm. They have some consumption utility. They get benefits from the good. Depends on how much of that good they consume. That's QI, quantity. It has some V function that says, hey, more of that good is good, but it declines, it's concave. And then everything else is in X, the numeraire good. There's a budget constraint that limits their ability to consume. They also have social preferences. This is going to have an altruism weight theta that is attached to other people's utility. So I care about your benefits. We'll have CSI, the consumer surplus of individual I, is the value they get from that quantity of good minus the price they pay to it times the quantity they bought. And then that's for each individual. And then the total consumer surplus in the economy is just summing up over all those individuals. We'll introduce a new, using Greek letters here, parameter gamma. Gamma I is your share of individuals I's share of the overall consumer surplus. So then we get this utility function that looks like this. A utility of some individual I is alpha I, the share of the firm they own, plus theta I, how much they care about other people's benefits, times the profits of the firm. Why? Because those profits are delivered to the shareholders and they use it for buying things. And this other term, which is gamma I, my share of the overall consumer surplus in the economy, plus theta I, my altruism weight on others, times that CS, total consumer surplus. So I care about profits because they allow me to buy stuff. I care about the consumer surplus in the economy, the stuff I've bought. Very standard utility function augmented with theta, the altruism weight. Okay, so we have this utility function for each individual. We can rescale that without any problem, and the utility of some individual then is just the benefit they get from profits plus lambda, some weight they attach to consumer surplus in the economy. And based on all the math we've done thus far, that individual is indifferent then between lambda I in profits and a $1 increase in consumer surplus. The structure of how we've set up the model tells us what lambda should be. It depends on the ratio on the top of their share of consumer surplus, gamma I, plus their altruism weight, divided by their share of ownership in the firm, plus that altruism weight. This allows us to see some quick results right away. That small amounts of altruism are going to matter a lot for small shareholders. As the share alpha of a firm that you own gets really small, then lambda is going to go towards 1 because altruism is just going to matter. You don't care about the financial returns that much. You don't get that much, but you get this benefit to others in the economy. So that's one result. Let's think now about the firm. The firm is going to sell its product. It sets a price P per unit, and it faces some demand curve Q of P. So it's going to sell some quantity that depends on the price it sets. It has constant marginal costs, and we're going to assume that fixed costs are equal to 0. So profits, that capital pi there, is price minus cost times the quantity it sells. Very standard model of the firm, very simple. Recall, a shareholder wants to maximize not just profits now. Their utility depends both on profits, but also consumer surplus in the economy. So when the shareholders tell the firm what to do, they won't want it to maximize solely profits. They want it to maximize by tilde, which is profits plus lambda times the weight on consumer surplus. Shareholders, we saw, we're going to have lambda I, their own particular desired value of lambda. And in the end, they're going to have to pick one lambda for the firm to implement, and there are a variety of different models of how they could resolve their disagreements. Model 1, you could take the median voter of shareholders. Model 2, you can maximize the weighted utility of shareholders. This is an ongoing academic debate. All right, so then we can get some mathematical results. Bear with me here. They're going to pay off when we get to some numerical calibrations. We can then derive how to optimally set prices. The proposition 1 here tells us that the optimal price that implements a shareholder's desired objective function gives a Lerner index, which is a very standard object, price minus cost over price. It's basically the markup as a percentage of price, is equal to 1 minus lambda times 1 over eta. Basically, 1 minus lambda times the reciprocal of the elasticity of demand. What does this mean here? Well, this takes the very standard case. If before I wrote this paper, when lambda is equal to 0 and shareholders just want firms to maximize profits, this Lerner index is 1 over eta. If the demand is really elastic, your markup is very small, and if demand is very inelastic, then your markup is very large. But now you can vary lambda. Put this in the model. And as lambda gets higher and higher and approaches 1, at lambda equals 1, the firm doesn't set any markup. 1 minus lambda is 0, and that means that it's going to price at marginal cost. So the degree of lambda will tell you how much of the profit maximizing markup it will charge. This idea is not entirely new to this paper. It builds out of existing literature. So Joe Farrell in 1985 wrote a model where you have an economy where everybody's homogeneous. Everyone's the same. You're consumers and you're also shareholders. Well, what do you want the firm to do? Well, you're all the same. And you're all going to get the benefit of profits as well as the benefit of consumption. And firms in this model, where everyone's the same, everybody wants the firm to price at marginal cost. Gans and co-authors generalize this to more heterogeneity and tell you some conditions for what the median shareholder has and what it should result in terms of firm pricing. It could be the monopoly case. It could be the marginal cost of pricing. So we're going to extend a little bit beyond that, have this continuous version of lambda that includes both self-interested motivations as well as altruism. OK, let's continue and get some more here. So how do you implement this? Well, it tells us that if we started from a profit-maximizing firm and wanted to now implement this lambda, the firm should lower its markup as a percentage of price by lambda % to implement optimal prices. The percentage change in price is going to depend on both lambda and the elasticity, right? So in high elasticity markets where markups are really low because they're really competitive, well, then you don't have you're not going to be pricing very far from marginal cost, and hence you're not going to get a big percentage change in price. But in perfectly competitive markets where there's high markups, now you start caring about consumer surplus, you're going to have a big percentage change in price. And the proposition 2 does that in math. All right, so we have shareholders wanting firms to account for their impact on consumers. How costly is it to do that? Well, as I said, economists know a lot about the structure of profit maximization, and the effects on profits are small relative to the benefits for consumers. So proposition 3 is a formal statement that says adding a small amount of weight on consumer surplus, so moving from lambda equals 0, not caring about consumer surplus at all, to a small lambda, has no first order effect on profits. So the effect on profits is vanishingly small, but does create a first order improvement on consumer welfare. And this comes from just how firms are setting prices at the optimal price when they're profit maximizing. What happens when you change the price a little bit? Virtually nothing. The first order condition for setting price is that a small increase in price doesn't raise your profits, a small decrease in price doesn't raise your profits. So that comes from the envelope theorem, and we have some additional assumptions there. But the benefits of consumers, what happens when you lower your price? Well, all the things you were buying before are now cheaper, so you get that money, and some new purchases occur that wouldn't have occurred before. All right, so well, we can say, well, that's a formal statement, but let's think about how much numerically this would matter in practice. Our formulas tell us that it depends on the demand elasticity in the market. And so we're going to need to take some different elasticities to do these calculations. Alka and co-authors estimate own price elasticities for various firms. I'll choose 2, an average automaker and an average grocery chain. So the automaker is 3.6 eta, and the grocery chain's eta of 1.9. We're going to plug them into our model, and how do sales change? How do profits change? That's what we get here. So first, let's look at the grocery market. We're going to have 3 different rows, one for different values of lambda. A small value of lambda, where $1 in profits is equal to $100 in consumer surplus. That's lambda of 0.01. Well, that means that you would lower your price by about 1%. And based on the elasticity, that would increase quantity by about 2%. Profits would go down negligible amount, less than 1%, so 0.01%. But the change in consumer surplus would be 2% of profit, of original profits. So the benefits to consumers relative to the cost and firms of this price decrease is 200 times. Well, we can think about, well, what about a bigger lambda? a lambda of 0.1 is a 10% decline in price. That leads to a 1% decline in profits, but the benefits to consumers now are 20 times bigger. Instead of 200, 21% increase in consumer surplus as a percentage of those original profits. Similarly, if we look at higher values of lambda, the ratio of gains goes down. The bigger the change you make is. They start out at very big gains to consumers relative to the cost to firms for small changes. And the overall benefit in absolute magnitude gets bigger when you have these big price declines, but so do the cost in terms of firm profits gets bigger as well. Auto market, they're going to give you something pretty similar, same kind of ratios, a 0.01 lambda. It's like a 0.5% decline in price here. That means that profits go down 0.007%, virtually nothing, and the change in consumer surplus is 1.4% of that original profit amount. So these are big increases in consumer benefits relative to the cost in terms that firms face. All right, so what might this value of lambda, weight on consumer surplus, be? Well, we can go and try to calibrate some parameters from data before we even go to the field with a survey. What should we expect here? We have our utility function, our value of lambda. We need to fill in these parameters. What is the share of consumer surplus an individual has, gamma I? What is their altruism weight, theta? What is their share in a firm's ownership, alpha I? So we need to think a little bit about what thought experiment we're even doing here. The fraction of consumer surplus captured by an individual in the real world, it depends on the degree of specificity. Are you voting for the price on a particular product? Are you voting for the strategy in the economy as a whole? And so I'm going to think about a very broad strategic parameter that you communicate to firms. You don't know what you're going to buy and from which particular firm, but you are a well-diversified index fund owner and need to tell Vanguard or BlackRock how to vote on your behalf to firms in general. How much should you care about consumer surplus? Well, then we can get a good calibration of that gamma, individual share of consumption. We just look at their share of consumption in the economy, assume it's equally divided across all firms. Median ownership share, we can just look at stock ownership data and again assume that individuals are fully diversified and own an equal share of all firms. These are very rough approximations. Well, let's take individuals in the top decile of income. We can go to the Consumer Expenditure Survey and the Survey of Consumer Finances to get this data. That top decile of income owns about 60% of the stock, consumes about 23% of total consumption. And so before we even think about altruism, assume theta is equal to 0, then we can put in this ratio. You get 23% of the benefits in terms of lower prices, and you pay 60% of the cost in lower profits. The value of lambda you want is 0.38, even without altruism for the wealthiest decile of people. So let's take and examine the preferences of middle income people, people in the 40th to 60th income quintile. If we look at them, they own about 6% of the total stock, and they consume 8.5% of total consumption. So that tells us right away that their role as consumers is actually more important to them than their role as stock owners. If you take the parameters then, it tells us alpha, their ownership share is 0.06, gamma is 0.085, and then their desired weight on consumer welfare, lambda, is 1.4, even without altruism. Note that that means that lambda here is greater than 1. They are actually happy to benefit consumers even if that benefit is less than the cost and profits, because their role as a consumer is more important. What we find from all these calibrations is that most people's self-interest leads them to want the firms that they own part of to place substantial positive weight on consumers. Okay, so what might this altruism parameter be? It's going to depend on context, and this is very much unknown. Lab experiments, in particular, study finds 0.6 weight on others' utility, plus some warm glow effect, there's a lot of heterogeneity out there. So I'm just going to pick and guess 0.2. So you would give up $1 if others got $5 in benefits instead. Well, then what would that mean? The top decile has a lambda of 0.5. $2 in consumer benefits is equal to $1 in profits. Or if you think about, well, let's forget about the consumer aspect. Let's say we just looked at people who didn't consume anything, but they're partially altruistic. What would they want? Well, they'd still want lambda of about 0.25. These weights, very rough estimates at this point, but we should expect non-trivial weights on consumer benefits that shareholders actually want before we even go to our survey experiment. So let's go now to our survey experiment. We're going to elicit from strategic survey questions, what do you want firms to do? We're going to recruit a sample of approximately 500 people, approximately representative of the US, using the Rand American Life panel. This is one of the questions and our key question we ask them. You said you own shares in this stock. Consider one of the companies you own stock in. Consider a shareholder vote on pricing strategy. Prices could be set to maximize the firm's overall present and future profits. Or you could set prices lower. This would reduce profits. However, it would benefit consumers who would pay lower prices and who might buy more. We're going to show you 8 different pairs of proposals, one after another. Each time tell us what you would vote for. Would you vote to maximize profits here? Or do you want to set prices lower, giving up $1 million in profits, but gaining $64 million for consumers? So they answer this question, and then the next question adapts based on their previous answer to try to find the point at which they switch from voting for lower prices to voting for maximizing profits, or vice versa. We're going to do that for benefits to consumers, but we want to benchmark our results. Let's also elicit shareholders' desired weight on environmental benefits. Same process. Would you like to produce in a way that maximizes profits? Or would you like to produce in a way that's more environmentally friendly? Give up $1 million in profits, but gain $64 million worth of environmental benefits to individuals. Same kind of iterative procedure. We're going to find their trade-off between profits and a dollar-weighted benefit to the environment. So these are strategic survey questions. They ask shareholders how they would vote on a general objective for the firm. That has some pros. It allows shareholders to express their preferences without needing to know what the actual trade-offs a firm faces are. But we'd like you to achieve this objective. I don't know how to do it. You're the firm, you're the manager, you achieve that objective. It is then distinct from votes on specific action items, which depend on their forecasted effect. Is it a valuable thing to produce this report that releases this set of information? Should we not make this investment in this kind of production technology? As a shareholder, I might not have the information to evaluate its actual impact on my objective. Here, I'm communicating what my objective actually is. It's a hypothetical vote here in this strategic survey question, right? So respondents aren't incentivized here. But if you note that they're also probably not very much incentivized for real shareholder votes. If you think about, well, what's the impact of your vote, it only matters if you're the pivotal voter, and there's a large literature on voting and why people vote. Shareholder votes are not as incentivized either, because you're unlikely to be pivotal. Talk about our sample. Roughly, I want you to take from this that we're roughly representative of the US. About half of our sample owns stock. We've targeted things like education and race and income distribution. The only way we're a little off is a political leaning is a little less Republican than average. That political leaning changes over the cycle, the news cycle. It's less stable than these other characteristics. This is our distribution of lambda. And so we get the elicited lambda. And it's really heterogeneous. You can see on the top panel here is the distribution for people who don't own stock. On the bottom panel, it's the distribution for people who do own stock. There's a whole group of people with lambda greater than 1. They're basically saying, hey, I'm happy if we transfer money away from firms to consumers, even if it's not 1-for-1, even if consumers benefit less. There's a lot of people who are consumer focused even though they own the firm. And there's a small number of people who are near zero. Not everyone, that bar, the lowest bar is where a lot of people are, about 20 to 25% of the sample. That's not a literal zero. Many people approach zero but have a small positive lambda. So 93% of this sample has a lambda that's actually strictly greater than zero, that we would not vote for pure maximizing profits. They're going to, at some point, be willing to trade off some profits for larger benefits to consumers. The median value here of lambda is 0.44. The mean's less informative here because it's affected by a lot of people with very high lambdas, but the median is 0.44. That's $44 in profits equal to $100 in consumer benefits. And interestingly, it matters whether you own stock already or not. If you own stock, the median is only 0.27, still quite substantial, quite important, but less than non-stock owners. We go ahead and elicit that weight on the environment, just like we did for the consumers, and it's a pretty similar story. Non-stockholders have a much higher weight on the environment than on consumers, but for people who own stock, the median values are actually identical at 0.27. The mean's about the same. You should take away from this that people care both about the environment and about consumers. In addition to asking what you would like, ask some other questions about what you think might happen. What would actually win in a shareholder vote that asks you to, should we maximize profits or give up some amount of profits in exchange for benefits to consumers? And most shareholders don't think that a substantially large lambda is going to win. That the median shareholder thinks that 0.01 is the winning lambda in a shareholder vote. So 1% weight on consumer benefits, that would take $100 to consumers for $1 in lost profits. Note though, our numeric calculations considered that case, and that's still a pretty important win for consumers. It's about a 1% decline in profits, and the gain to consumers is 200 times the loss to firms from a small price decrease there. Similarly, people don't forecast big environmental implementation either in terms of winning these votes. Okay, so consumer welfare seems to be valued by shareholders, but also seems to be missing from the CSR and ESG objectives debate. And so why is that? Made the case that there's these big gains for firms to consider consumer welfare because they have this unique pricing technology, lower prices, benefits consumers at a low price profit cost. And so I go to this same sample and ask them, well, what do you think is going to happen if firms decrease prices, right? Recall, the benefit of our methodology is that we just have shareholders tell firms what they want the objective to be. They don't necessarily communicate what they think the outcome of a price decrease will be. So we ask, well, suppose a firm lowered prices and gave up $1 million in profits. What do you think the benefit to consumers would be? And we give people this set of categories that you see below to respond in. And Calibrations, if you recall, our numbers suggested it depended on how big that price decrease was. But we're thinking about things of like 100 times to 20 times the loss in profits in terms of gains to consumers. But let's look at this result here, and 23% of the sample thinks that the gains to consumers will only be half the cost and lost profits. So that's a big puzzle. If you add the next category, that's approximately 1-for-1, you have about 40% of people answering this survey question saying, I don't think the gains to consumers will exceed the cost of lost profits. So why is it not this part of this debate, the weight on consumers? Well, it seems that a large number of people don't see these big gains to lowering prices. Shareholders may not understand how large the social gains from lower prices in imperfectly competitive markets are. So to conclude, shareholders are willing to forgo profits to give larger benefits to consumers. Only 7% of the sample was willing to vote for pure profit maximization and take no gain to consumers was big enough for them to give up money and profits. Most people are willing to give up some profits for very large gains to consumers. The firm has this unique technology for promoting consumer surplus, a comparative advantage here, which is lowering prices in imperfectly competitive markets. The gains to even small price decreases can be substantial. A 1% decline in prices gives you about a 0.01% decline in profits, but consumers gain 200 times that amount. And firms, I've focused on firms and their pricing strategies, but there are a variety of other ways that firms might promote consumer surplus. And some of them include avoiding shrouded prices or hidden add-ons or sludge, harmful nudges. There's more to be done here, but I think this paper shows that the social impact of lower prices is a very important part of the social impact of firms.